My name is Tyler Grant, and until recently I thought my life was picture perfect. My wife, Morgan, and I had been married for 12 years. We had two wonderful kids, Emily, 10, and Noah, 8. We lived in a cozy suburban home just outside of Denver. I worked in tech sales, a job that demanded long hours, but paid well enough to keep us comfortable. Morgan was a part-time interior designer with a flair for creativity that always left me in awe. It was the little things that made our life feel so complete. Weekend picnics in the park, movie nights with popcorn and laughter, and the quiet evenings where we'd share a bottle of wine after the kids were asleep. Morgan had a spark about her. She was the type of woman who could light up a room with her laughter and charm. I often thought of myself as the luckiest guy alive to have her by my side. But lately, something had felt off. At first, I dismissed it. She was busier than usual, taking on more clients and spending late nights at her studio. She seemed distant, distracted even, but when I asked her about it, she'd brush it off with a warm smile and a quick excuse. "Just deadlines, Ty," she'd say, her green eyes twinkling with a tired but reassuring look. I wanted to believe her. Then came the night that began unraveling the world I thought I knew. I'd come home early from work, hoping to surprise her with a bouquet of her favorite lilies and a plan to take her out for a spontaneous date night. But when I pulled into the driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. A sleek black sedan with tinted windows. It seemed out of place in our quiet neighborhood. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The kids were at my parents' for the weekend, so I figured Morgan might be in her studio. As I walked through the house, the faint sound of laughter caught my attention. It was coming from upstairs, our bedroom. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. A chill ran down my spine as I crept up the stairs, careful not to make a sound. The door was ajar, and through the crack, I could see the edge of the bed. My stomach twisted into knots as I heard voices, Morgan's voice and a man's, low and unfamiliar. They were laughing, talking in hushed tones. For a moment, I considered walking away. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe this wasn't what it seemed. But the knot in my gut told me otherwise. I pushed the door open, and there she was, sitting on the edge of the bed with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, well-dressed, and too comfortable in my home. Morgan looked up at me, her face a mixture of shock and annoyance, as if I were the one who had walked into the wrong room. "Tyler," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "This isn't what it looks like." Her words hung in the air, hollow and meaningless. The man stood, buttoning his shirt and mumbling something about leaving. I didn't even hear him. All I could focus on was her, the woman I loved, the woman I trusted. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She hesitated for a moment before crossing her arms and meeting my gaze. "He's a client, Tyler. We were just talking. In our bedroom." She sighed, exasperated. "You're being dramatic. Nothing happened. He's just a friend." My world was spinning, but somehow I managed to stay grounded enough to respond. "Friends don't meet in bedrooms, Morgan, and they don't lie to their husbands." Her expression hardened, and she threw up her hands. "Oh, so now I'm the bad guy? Maybe if you weren't so wrapped up in work all the time, I wouldn't have to find someone else to talk to." Her words hit like a slap to the face, each syllable dripping with venom. My jaw clenched, and I could feel the rage bubbling just beneath the surface. But I didn't yell. I didn't scream. Instead, I took a deep breath and turned to leave. "Tyler," she called after me, her tone suddenly softer. "Can we just talk about this?" I paused at the door, gripping the frame so hard my knuckles turned white. Without looking back, I said, "I'll be in touch when I'm ready to talk. Until then, don't call me." I walked out of the house and into the cool night air, my mind racing. There was no going back. Not after this. Little did Morgan know, I wasn't just walking away. I was planning something she would never see coming. I didn't go far that night, just to the motel on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where the walls were thin and the sheets smelled like bleach, but it didn't matter. I needed to think. I needed space. The lilies I'd bought for Morgan sat on the passenger seat of my truck, their delicate petals mocking me with their beauty. I tossed them into the motel parking lot before heading inside, leaving a trail of crushed flowers in my wake. Once in the room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the TV as an infomercial droned on about some miracle kitchen gadget. My mind was a hurricane of questions. How long had this been going on? Who was that man? What else was she hiding? I reached for my phone, hesitating before opening our text thread. Her messages were always warm and affectionate, full of emojis and little updates about her day. But now, they felt like a lie. I scrolled back through months of conversations, searching for anything that might have hinted at what was happening behind my back. Nothing. She'd covered her tracks well. But Morgan wasn't perfect. No one is. I was had to find the cracks. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her again. Not yet. First, I needed proof. Concrete evidence that she couldn't talk her way out of. And if there was one thing I knew, it was that people always slip up eventually. I called in sick to work, something I hadn't done in years, and set up shop in my truck outside our house. From that vantage point, I had a clear view of the driveway and front door. I told Morgan I needed space, and she hadn't reached out since I'd left. That alone was telling. No frantic calls or tearful apologies. Just silence. Around noon, the black sedan returned. The same car I'd seen parked across the street the night before. I tensed as the man stepped out, looking every bit the suave professional. He carried a leather briefcase and walked with the confidence of someone who'd never had to second-guess a decision in his life. I snapped a few pictures of him on my phone, noting the license plate before he disappeared inside. Then I waited. 2 hours later, he emerged, looking just as composed as when he arrived. As he drove off, I followed, keeping a safe distance. He led me downtown to an upscale office building with a sleek, mirrored exterior. The kind of place where deals were made and secrets were kept. I parked across the street and watched as he entered the building. A quick Google search of the address revealed it was home to several law firms and consulting agencies. It didn't take long to find him. His name was Grant Reynolds, and he was a corporate attorney. Married, according to his firm's website. The irony wasn't lost on me. I drove back to the house, my mind racing. If Morgan was involved with Grant, it wasn't just an affair, it was a calculated betrayal. But why? What did she see in him that she didn't see in me? The question gnawed at me, but I pushed it aside. Answers would come later. Right now, I needed to stay focused. Back at the house, I let myself in using the spare key. Morgan was still at her studio, so I had time to look around. I started in the bedroom, checking drawers and closets for anything out of place. It didn't take long to find her secret, a second phone, tucked away in a shoebox at the back of her closet. My hands trembled as I powered it on, the screen lighting up to reveal a lock screen with a simple numeric code. After a few wrong guesses, I tried Emily's birthday. Bingo! The messages were a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Texts between Morgan and Grant, filled with flirty banter and suggestive emojis. Plans for dinners, weekend getaways, and cryptic references to business meetings. My stomach churned as I read each one, the words twisting like knives in my gut. But one message stood out. It was from Grant, sent just a few days ago. Can't wait for the cabin this weekend. Just the two of us. The cabin. I knew exactly where it was. A secluded property in the mountains that Morgan and I had rented a few times for family vacations. She must have rebooked it without telling me. I snapped pictures of the messages for my records before carefully placing the phone back where I found it. As I left the house, a plan began to form in my mind. If they wanted a weekend getaway, they'd get one. But it wouldn't go the way they expected. The cabin was nestled deep in the Rockies, a good 2-hour drive from town. Morgan and I had spent some of our happiest weekends there with the kids, hiking, roasting marshmallows by the fire, and watching the stars. It was quiet, isolated, and now, it was about to become the stage for something entirely different. I made the drive early the next morning, under the cover of dawn. The air was crisp, and the mountains were painted in shades of amber and gold by the rising sun. It was beautiful, but I barely noticed. My mind was too focused on the plan. When I arrived, the cabin looked just as I remembered, quaint, with a wraparound porch and a stone chimney that leaned slightly to the left. I parked my truck out of sight and began preparing. Inside, the cabin was cozy, with wood-paneled walls and a fireplace that still smelled faintly of ash. I scanned the room, thinking about where to set everything up. This wasn't just about catching Morgan and Grant in the act. It was about creating something unforgettable, something they'd never be able to explain away. I unpacked the bag I'd brought with me. Hidden cameras, a small recording device, and a few personal touches I'd picked up on the way. I installed the cameras in strategic spots: the living room, the bedroom, and the kitchen, each one positioned to capture every angle of their weekend. The recording device went under the couch cushions, sensitive enough to pick up even the softest whispers. But the piece de resistance? That would come later. By the time I finished setting everything up, it was almost noon. I checked and double-checked the equipment, making sure everything was running smoothly. Then, I left, locking the door behind me and driving to a nearby motel to wait. The next day, Morgan's second phone buzzed with a text from Grant. On my way to the cabin. Can't wait to see you. I'd cloned her phone to mine the night before, using software I'd found online. Every message, every call, every location ping, it all came to me in real time. When Morgan responded with a coy, "Me too. Drive safe," my stomach churned, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was what I wanted. Proof. Closure. Around 3 p.m., the cameras I'd set up in the cabin began streaming to my laptop. First, Grant arrived, carrying a bouquet of roses and a bottle of wine. He looked every bit the smug, self-assured man I'd seen before. He set the roses on the kitchen counter and poured himself a glass of wine, settling onto the couch as he waited. Morgan showed up about 20 minutes later, wearing a dress I'd never seen before, tight, red, and far too revealing for a casual weekend in the mountains. She greeted Grant with a kiss, her arms wrapping around his neck, as if she didn't have a husband and 2 kids waiting for her back home. I watched as they made themselves comfortable, laughing, drinking, and leaning into each other like teenagers on their first date. It was nauseating, but I couldn't look away. Every smile, every touch, every stolen glance, it all fueled the fire inside me. When night fell, I put the second part of my plan into action. I drove back to the cabin, parking my truck a mile down the road and walking the rest of the way. The air was cold, my breath visible in the moonlight, but I didn't care. Adrenaline kept me warm. I approached the cabin quietly, using the trees as cover. Through the window, I could see them sitting on the couch, Morgan's head on Grant's shoulder as they watched a movie. It was almost comical how comfortable they looked, like they belonged there, like I didn't exist. That would change soon. I waited until the lights went out, signaling they'd gone to bed. Then, I crept onto the porch, pulling out the final piece of my plan. A small, inconspicuous USB drive. It was loaded with a custom-made program, a slideshow of the photos and videos I'd collected over the past few days, set to an old love song Morgan had once called our song. I slipped inside, my heart pounding as I inserted the USB into the TV. Then I left, making sure to lock the door behind me. Back in my truck, I waited. It didn't take long. The cabin lit up as the TV turned on, the song playing softly at first, then growing louder. Through the window, I saw them scramble out of the bedroom, confused and panicked as they stared at the screen. Their faces shifted from confusion to horror as the images played. Morgan and Grant, together, exposed for what they were. I couldn't hear their reactions, but I didn't need to. The looks on their faces were enough. Satisfied, I drove away, the sound of tires crunching gravel the only noise in the still night. Whatever happened next was up to them. For me, it was only the beginning. Driving back into town that night, I felt a strange mixture of emotions: anger, satisfaction, and an overwhelming sense of emptiness. I had imagined that exposing Morgan's betrayal would feel vindicating, like a weight being lifted. Instead, it felt like I had cracked open a dam, and now the floodwaters of my emotions were rushing in, drowning me. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces on the cabin's couch, staring in shock at the slideshow of their own lies. I kept picturing Morgan's expression, a combination of guilt and fear, etched into my memory like a brand. By the next morning, I was mentally exhausted but determined to keep going. I checked my phone first thing, half expecting Morgan to have called or texted. Nothing. The silence was louder than any argument we could have had. Instead, it was an email that caught my attention. It was from Grant Reynolds, sent to my work address. How he'd found it, I didn't know, but the message was short and direct. Tyler, we need to talk. Call me when you're ready. I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. What could he possibly have to say to me? There was no apology that could fix this, no explanation that could undo what they had done. Still, I filed the email away for later. Let him squirm. Later that morning, I drove by the house. Morgan's car was in the driveway, but the curtains were drawn, and the place looked eerily still. I parked a few houses down and waited, watching for any signs of movement. It didn't take long. Just after noon, she stepped outside, carrying a small suitcase. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen, as if she'd been crying. I ducked down in my seat as she loaded the bag into the car and drove away. This was my chance. I let myself into the house, moving quickly but carefully. The air inside felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. Everything looked the same as I'd left it 2 days ago, but it all felt different, tainted. The kitchen, where we'd shared countless meals. The living room, where we'd laughed with the kids. The bedroom, where she'd betrayed me. I went straight to her studio in the back of the house. It was a bright, airy space filled with sketches, fabric samples, and half-finished designs. It was also the room where she'd spent countless hours working late. I started going through her things, looking for anything that might give me more answers. At first, it was just the usual design notes, receipts, and client files. But then I found a small leather notebook, tucked away in a drawer beneath a pile of fabric swatches. Flipping through it, I realized it was her journal. My hands trembled as I read the entries, each one offering a window into her mind. June 5th. Grant is so charming. He makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. Tyler is so distant these days, always working. I don't think he even sees me anymore. July 12th. I told myself this would stop, but I can't seem to let go. Grant understands me in a way Tyler never has. It's not just physical, it's emotional. Does that make it worse? August 20th. I feel so torn. I love Tyler, but it's not the same as it used to be. Grant says he loves me, and part of me believes him. What if he's the one I'm meant to be with? Each entry was like a dagger, cutting deeper and deeper. By the time I reached the final page, I was shaking with rage. She hadn't just cheated on me physically. She betrayed me emotionally, questioned everything we'd built together. I snapped pictures of the most damning entries with my phone and put the journal back where I'd found it. Then I left the house, locking the door behind me and driving aimlessly through town. That evening, as I sat in my truck, parked in an empty lot, my phone buzzed. It was Morgan. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. I answered. "Tyler," she said, her voice shaky. "Can we talk? Please?" I was silent for a moment, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. Then I spoke, my tone cold and measured. "Why? So you can lie to me some more?" "No," she said quickly. I need to explain. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but it doesn't mean I don't love you." "Love me?" I laughed bitterly. "You have a funny way of showing it, Morgan." "Please, Tyler," she pleaded. "Just let me see you. Let me explain." I hesitated, a part of me wanting to hear her out, the other part screaming that she didn't deserve the chance. Finally, I sighed. "Phoenix, tomorrow, noon, the diner on Main." "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. I hung up without another word, already dreading what was to come. Whatever she had to say, it wouldn't change anything, but it would give me one last opportunity to deliver the next blow in my plan. The next day, I arrived at the diner early, taking a booth in the corner where I could see the door. It was a quiet place, the kind of spot where you could have a long conversation without anyone overhearing. I sat nursing a black coffee, the bitterness matching my mood. Morgan showed up right on time, her face pale and drawn, her usual confidence replaced with a hesitant uncertainty. She scanned the room until her eyes met mine, then walked over, her steps slow and deliberate. She slid into the seat across from me, clasping her hands together on the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, broken only by the clink of dishes and the hum of conversation from the other patrons. Finally, she spoke. "Thank you for meeting me." I didn't respond. I just stared at her, waiting for her to continue. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "Tyler, I don't even know where to start. What I did, it was wrong. There's no excuse. But I need you to understand, it wasn't about you." I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. "Not about me? You destroyed our family, Morgan. You betrayed me and our kids. And you're saying it wasn't about me?" She flinched at my words but pressed on. "I felt so lost these past few years. Like I was invisible. You were always working, always distracted. I felt like I was just existing. And then Grant came along, and he made me feel." "Don't you dare say special," I interrupted, my voice low and sharp. "Don't you dare try to justify what you did with some cliché about feeling neglected." She looked down at her hands, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm not trying to justify it. I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. But I love you, Tyler. I always have. And I want to fix this. I want us to be a family again." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I almost believed her. Almost. But then I remembered the messages, the journal, the look on her face when she'd kissed Grant. "You think love is enough to fix this?" I asked, my voice cold. "Do you even understand what you've done?" She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I know I've ruined everything, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right." "Is that so?" I leaned back in my seat, my mind racing. "Tell me, Morgan, what would you have done if I hadn't found out? Would you have stopped? Or would you have kept sneaking around, lying to my face?" Her silence was answer enough. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, sliding it across the table. The screen displayed the messages I'd saved, the photos and videos of her with Grant. Her face drained of color as she scrolled through them, her hands shaking. "You think this can be fixed?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "After everything you've done?" She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "I don't want your apologies, Morgan. I don't want your tears. What I want is the truth. All of it. Right now." Her lips trembled as she spoke. "It started a few months ago. He was a client, and we spent a lot of time together on a project. At first, it was just flirting, but then..." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't." I felt a bitter laugh escape my lips. "You didn't mean for it to go this far? That's the best you've got." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "Please, Tyler, I'll do anything to make this right." I stared at her, the woman I'd loved for over a decade, and felt nothing but a cold emptiness. She wanted to fix things, but some things couldn't be fixed. I stood, tossing a few bills onto the table. "You've said enough, Morgan. I'll be in touch." "Tyler, wait," she called after me, but I didn't stop. I walked out of the diner and into the bright afternoon sun, my mind already on the next step. Morgan wanted to make things right, but she had no idea what right looked like in my book. Driving away from the diner, my mind buzzed with the remnants of Morgan's excuses and half-hearted pleas. I kept replaying her words, trying to dissect the lies from the fragments of truth. She wanted to make it right, but I knew better. There was no making this right. Not for her. I pulled over into a quiet parking lot and sat there for a while, staring at my phone. Grant Reynolds' email still sat unread in my inbox. The idea of responding made my skin crawl, but I couldn't ignore the opportunity it presented. If Morgan was the knife that cut me, then Grant was the hand that wielded it. He needed to pay too. With a deep breath, I opened the email and typed a reply. "Grant, I've seen enough to understand what's been going on. If you're serious about talking, meet me tonight at 8 p.m. The old factory on Riverside. Alone." I hit send, my stomach twisting with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. Grant wasn't just some random fling. He was calculated, deliberate. He thought he could waltz into my life and take what was mine. That arrogance would be his undoing. The old factory was a relic from another time, abandoned and overgrown with weeds. Its cracked windows and rusted walls loomed against the fading light, casting eerie shadows across the ground. It was the perfect place for a confrontation. I arrived early, parking my truck behind a row of bushes to keep it hidden. Inside, the factory was a maze of empty rooms and creaking metal. I chose a spot in the central hall, where the dim moonlight streaming through the broken roof gave the place an almost theatrical ambience. At exactly 8 p.m., I heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the factory. Grant stepped into view, his silhouette sharp against the gloom. He looked uneasy, his eyes darting around as if he expected an ambush. "Tyler," he said, his voice steady but low. "I'm glad you agreed to meet." I stepped out of the shadows, keeping my expression neutral. "Let's get this over with." Grant took a cautious step closer, holding his hands up as if to placate me. "Look, I'm not here to make excuses. I know I crossed the line, and I'm sorry." "Sorry?" I laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. "You're sorry? That's all you've got." He flinched but held his ground. "I know I can't undo what happened, but I need you to know it wasn't personal." Morgan came to me. She said, "Don't you dare." I interrupted, my voice cold as steel. "Don't you dare put this on her." He hesitated, then nodded. "You're right. It was my choice, and I made the wrong one. I don't want to cause any more pain." I stared at him, searching for a crack in his calm demeanor. "You've already caused enough pain. You tore apart my family. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" Grant shifted uncomfortably. "What do you want, Tyler? Money? A public apology? Just tell me, and I'll do it." "Money." I took a step closer, my voice low and dangerous. "Do you think this is about money?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't let him. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about fixing things. It's about justice." Grant's eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw real fear. "Tyler, let's be reasonable." "Reasonable?" I let out a dark chuckle. "You've already seen my version of reasonable." Before he could say another word, I pulled out my phone and hit play. The recording of Morgan and Grant's conversations filled the empty hall, their laughter and whispered promises echoing off the walls. His face went pale as the evidence of their betrayal surrounded him. What do you want me to do?" he stammered, his composure finally cracking. I leaned in, my voice cold and steady. "You're going to end this. You're going to walk away from Morgan and stay out of my family's life. And if you don't, this recording, along with every photo and video I've collected, will find its way to your wife, your boss, and anyone else who matters to you." Grant's face drained of color. "You wouldn't." "Try me," I said, pocketing my phone. "You've underestimated me once. Don't make the same mistake twice." He swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine. I'll leave her alone." "Good," I said, turning to leave. "Oh, and Grant." He looked up, his expression wary. "If I ever see your face again, there won't be a conversation next time." I walked out of the factory without looking back, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty space. My chest felt lighter, but the weight of Morgan's betrayal still lingered. This wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. I spent the next day in a fog of mixed emotions. Relief that Grant was out of the picture, and a simmering rage that Morgan had invited him into our lives in the first place. The confrontation at the factory had gone exactly as I planned, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the first step in a long, bitter war. That evening, I decided it was time to confront Morgan with everything I knew. No more dancing around the truth. No more excuses. It was time for her to face the reality of what she'd done and the consequences. I walked into the house just after 6. The kids were at a friend's house for a sleepover, so it was just the two of us. Morgan was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of something that smelled faintly of garlic and thyme. She glanced up when she heard the door, her face a mask of forced normalcy. "Hey," she said softly. "I wasn't sure if you were coming home tonight." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I took off my jacket, hung it on the back of a chair, and sat down at the kitchen table. Morgan turned off the stove and wiped her hands on a dish towel before sitting across from me. "Tyler," she began, her voice tentative, "I want to talk about—" "No," I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. "You don't get to start this conversation. You don't." She flinched but said nothing. I pulled out my phone and slid it across the table, the screen displaying the photos and videos I collected. "Look at these, Morgan. Really look at them, because this is what you've done to our marriage." Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone. She scrolled through the images, her face growing paler with each swipe. By the time she reached the videos, her eyes were brimming with tears. Tyler, she started, but I held up a hand to silence her. Don't, I said, my voice low and cold. Don't you dare try to explain this away. Don't tell me it was a mistake or that it didn't mean anything. You don't get to rewrite the narrative to make yourself feel better. She looked down, her tears spilling onto the table. I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust. But I still love you, Tyler. I never stop. I leaned forward, my gaze locking onto hers. Love? You call this love? Sneaking around, lying to my face, and humiliating me? That's not love, Morgan. That's selfishness. Her tears came harder now, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. But I felt no sympathy. Not yet. I need to know why, I said, my voice softening just enough to let her speak. Why him? Why now? Was I really that bad of a husband? She shook her head fiercely. No, Tyler, you weren't. You're an amazing husband, an amazing father. It wasn't about you. It was about me. I felt lost, invisible, and Grant made me feel. Don't, I snapped, cutting her off. Don't you dare give me that cliche. You felt invisible? I worked my ass off to give you and the kids everything you needed. I trusted you. I loved you. I know, she whispered, her voice breaking. I know you did, and I threw it all away. But I was weak, Tyler. I let myself believe I deserved something more, even though I already had everything. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in her facade. The regret, the guilt, the shame. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. I talked to Grant, I said, watching her reaction closely. Her eyes widened in shock, and she looked like she might be sick. He's out of the picture. For good. You talked to him? She stammered. Yes. And I made sure he understands the consequences of coming near you, or our family, again. She buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. Tyler, I'm so sorry. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to fix this. I want to fix us. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. Fix us? You think that's possible after what you've done? After the lies, the betrayal, the humiliation? I'll do anything, she pleaded, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. I'll prove to you that I'm still the woman you fell in love with. I stared at her for a long moment, the silence between us heavy and charged. Part of me wanted to believe her, to cling to the hope that we could somehow rebuild what she'd destroyed. But another part, the colder, harder part, knew better. You want to prove yourself? I said finally. Then you'll sign over your share of the house to me. You'll agree to a post-nuptial agreement that protects me and the kids if this ever happens again. And you'll be honest about everything. She nodded, her tears falling freely. Anything, Tyler. I'll do anything. I stood, pushing the chair back with a scrape. Good. Then we'll see if you're serious. As I walked out of the kitchen, her sobs echoed behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Not yet. The days that followed were a blur of tension and cold formality. Morgan was on her best behavior, clinging to every opportunity to prove she was serious about repairing the damage. She cleaned the house obsessively, made meals she knew I liked, and even went out of her way to spend time with the kids, trying to reclaim her role as the perfect wife and mother. I let her. I played along, nodding and responding when necessary, but I kept my guard up. This wasn't forgiveness. It was a test. I wanted to see if her remorse was genuine or just a desperate attempt to avoid the consequences. But there was another layer to this game she didn't know about. While Morgan was busy trying to rebuild her image, I was quietly setting the stage for something she would never see coming. It started with a call to my lawyer, Jim Blake, an old college buddy who specialized in family law. We met at his office one evening after work, the blinds drawn and the door locked for privacy. Tyler, Jim said, leaning back in his chair, I've got to be honest. What you're asking for is unorthodox. I nodded, my expression grim. I know, but I need to do this. I need to protect myself and the kids. Jim sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, I can draft the post-nuptial agreement and handle the property transfer, no problem. But this other part? It's risky. If she finds out, she won't. I interrupted, my tone firm. This has to stay between us, Jim. No one else can know. He hesitated for a moment before nodding. All right, I'll do it. But you'd better be sure about this, Tyler. Once we cross this line, there's no going back. I'm sure, I said, my voice steady. She took everything from me. It's time I take it back. The next step was a conversation with Morgan. I waited until the kids were in bed, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine, when I walked into the room. Can we talk? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She looked up, her eyes wary but hopeful. Of course. I sat down across from her, pulling a stack of papers from my bag. These are the agreements I mentioned. I need you to sign them. Her face paled as she flipped through the documents. A post-nuptial agreement? Tyler, this feels so final. It's not final, I said evenly. It's protection. For me. For the kids. You said you'd do whatever it takes to prove yourself. This is part of that. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she held the papers. I don't want you to feel like you can't trust me. Trust has to be earned, Morgan. I said, my voice firm but not unkind. This is how you start earning it back. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, I'll sign. The next morning, we went to Jim's office to finalize the paperwork. Morgan was quiet, her demeanor subdued as she signed her name on the dotted lines. Jim handled everything with professional detachment, but I could see the concern in his eyes. Once it was done, Morgan turned to me. Are we okay now? I forced a small smile. It's a start, she nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'll keep proving myself, Tyler. I promise. As we left the office, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Morgan thought she was taking the first steps toward redemption, but she had no idea what was really happening. The agreements weren't just about protection. They were about leverage. With her signature, I now had control over the house, the finances, and the narrative. And then came the final piece of the puzzle, something even Jim didn't know about. That night, after Morgan went to bed, I opened my laptop and logged into an encrypted email account I'd set up weeks earlier. Attached to the email were the photos, videos, and journal entries I'd collected, along with a detailed summary of everything I'd uncovered. The recipient? Grant Reynolds' wife. I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the send button. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about dismantling the life of the man who thought he could walk into mine and take what he wanted. But it was also about justice. His wife deserved to know the truth, just like I had. With a deep breath, I clicked send. The next morning, the fallout began. I received an email from Grant's wife, thanking me for the information and confirming that she'd confronted him. Her words were cold, measured, a stark contrast to the chaos I imagined was unfolding in their home. Grant's world was crumbling, and I had front-row seats. But this wasn't just about him. It was about Morgan, too. She thought she'd escaped unscathed, but she was about to learn that actions have consequences, and I was the one writing the final chapter. The fallout came quicker than I expected. By the time I got home from work the next day, Morgan was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. The air between us was heavy, charged with tension that had been building for weeks. You talked to her, didn't you? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. Who? I asked, feigning ignorance as I set my bag down on the counter. Grant's wife, she said, her tone sharpening. She called him this morning. He's losing everything, his marriage, his career. And it's because of you. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. It's because of you, Morgan. You're the one who brought him into our lives. You're the one who made choices that destroyed everything we built. Don't put this on me. She stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You didn't have to go this far, Tyler. I'm trying to fix things, and you... Fix things? I interrupted, my voice rising. You think signing a few papers and playing the perfect wife for a couple of weeks makes up for what you did? For the lies, the betrayal. Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't stop. Grant deserves everything that's coming to him. And so do you. Her face crumpled, and she sank back into the chair. I didn't mean for it to get this bad, she whispered. I didn't know how to stop. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly snuffed out by the memory of her texts, her journal, the way she had smiled at Grant like he was her entire world. I couldn't let myself soften, not yet. Later that night, as the house fell silent, I received a notification on my phone. It was a new email from Grant's wife. "Tyler, I can't thank you enough for what you've done. Knowing the truth has been devastating, but it's also given me the strength to make decisions I should have made a long time ago. I'm filing for divorce and sending copies of the evidence you provided to Grant's firm. He won't just lose me, he'll lose everything. Thank you for standing up for what's right." I stared at the email, my chest tightening. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about justice. And while it felt good to see Grant's life unraveling, it didn't erase the pain of Morgan's betrayal. I locked my phone and laid back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. For weeks, I'd been so focused on exposing their lies and dismantling their lives that I hadn't stopped to think about what came next. Morgan was still here, still trying to claw her way back into my good graces, but I didn't know if I could ever look at her the same way again. The next morning, Morgan approached me as I was getting ready for work. Her face was pale, her eyes puffy from lack of sleep. "Tyler," she said softly, "I need to know, is there any hope for us? Or are you just waiting for the right moment to leave?" I paused. My tie half nodded and met her gaze. "I don't know," I admitted. "Right now, I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I even want to." Her shoulders sagged, and she nodded. "I deserve that. I want you to know that I'm not giving up on us. I'll do whatever it takes." I didn't respond. Instead, I grabbed my bag and left the house, her words echoing in my mind as I drove to work. That afternoon, I received a call from Jim, my lawyer. He sounded uneasy. "Tyler, I've been looking into some of the financials you asked about," he said, "and I found something you need to see." "What is it?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "It's about Morgan," he said, hesitating. "She's been moving money, small amounts but consistently, and it's going to an account I can't trace." A cold wave of suspicion washed over me. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 6 months, Jim said. It might be nothing, but—" "It's not nothing," I said, cutting him off. "Send me everything you've got." As I hung up, my mind raced. Morgan had sworn she was trying to fix things, but this new revelation cast everything into doubt. What was she hiding? And why? Whatever it was, I was determined to find out. The game wasn't over. Not yet. And if Morgan thought she could outmaneuver me, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The discovery of Morgan's secret account was the spark I needed to dig deeper. I spent the next few days combing through our financial records, tracking every withdrawal, transfer, and expense that didn't align with our usual spending. The deeper I went, the more disturbing the patterns became. The money wasn't just disappearing, it was going towards something or someone I couldn't yet identify. I reached out to Jim again, asking him to expedite a full financial audit. Meanwhile, I planted a hidden recorder in Morgan's studio, knowing it was the one place she spent time alone. If she was still hiding something, I needed to hear it for myself. A week later, Jim called with the results of the audit. His voice was heavy. "Tyler, you're not going to like this," he said. "Just tell me." I replied, bracing myself. "She's been funneling money into an offshore account. It's tied to a shell company registered under her name and Grant Reynolds' name." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. "Grant's name? You're sure?" "Positive," Jim said. "It looks like they set this up months ago. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't just an affair, it was financial. They were building something behind your back." I felt the room spin, my grip tightening on the phone. "How much money are we talking about?" "Over $60,000, Jim said. "And it's still climbing." That night, I confronted Morgan. She was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I walked in and dropped the financial audit on the counter. "What's this?" she asked, her voice trembling as she looked at the papers. "You tell me," I said, crossing my arms. "An offshore account? A shell company? 60 grand missing? What the hell have you been doing, Morgan?" Her face went pale, her hands clutching the edge of the counter. "Tyler, I can explain." "Then explain," I snapped, my voice cold and unyielding. She hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. "It started as a safety net." Grant said. "Grant said?" I interrupted, my anger boiling over. You were still working with him? Even after everything? She nodded, her tears spilling over. I didn't know how to stop Tyler. He told me it was for us, for our future. If things ever went south, we'd have a way out. I stared at her, the pieces falling into place. So this wasn't just about you feeling invisible. You were building an escape plan. From me. No, she cried, shaking her head. It wasn't like that. I swear, Tyler, I never wanted to leave you. I made a mistake. A huge mistake. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and cold. A mistake? That's what you call this? You lied to me, betrayed me, and stole from me. That's not a mistake, Morgan. That's a goddamn betrayal. She collapsed into a chair, sobbing. Please, Tyler. I'll fix it. I'll transfer the money back. I'll dissolve the company. Just give me a chance. I stood there for a long moment, watching her crumble. Part of me wanted to believe her, to give her one last chance. But the other part, the part that had been burned too many times, knew better. The next morning, I made my decision. I met with Jim and filed for divorce, using the post-nuptial agreement Morgan had signed to protect myself and the kids. The house, the savings, the custody arrangements, it was all locked in my favor. When I told Morgan, her reaction was a mix of shock and devastation. She begged, pleaded, promised to change, but I didn't waver. The trust was gone, and there was no getting it back. A month later, the divorce was finalized. Morgan moved into a small apartment across town, her once perfect life reduced to a shadow of what it had been. Grant's wife followed through on her promise, exposing him to his firm and leaving him jobless and alone. As for me, I focused on rebuilding. I poured my energy into my kids, my work, and my own healing. The scars of Morgan's betrayal would take time to fade, but I was determined not to let them define me. In the end, I didn't just survive, I thrived. Morgan and Grant had tried to take everything from me, but I took it all back and then some. Justice wasn't just served, it was my victory, and it was theirs to live with for the rest of their lives. What do you guys think of my story? Share in the comments what you think about the choice I made, and would you do in my situation.